So welcome everyone to the Humanities Council webinar, People, Politics, and Representation. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Nancy Love, a professor of political science and Humanities Council coordinator at Appalachian State University. Before we begin our first session, I would like to thank everyone who made this webinar possible. They include the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, the members of the Humanities Council, many of whom you will meet today, Tom Van Gilder, Director of Learning Technology Services, Rob Gelber, Director of AppTV, our student television station, and most important, Sonia Wilson, who is the student intern and producer of this webinar and our host behind the scenes today. Thank you, all of you. And without further ado, I would now like to introduce Dr. Heather Waldrop, a member of the Humanities Council, Professor of Art History, and Associate Dean of the Honors College. She will introduce and facilitate our first session.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everyone. Let's see. As Nancy said, my name is Heather Waldrop, and I'm at the Honors College and also Professor of Art History here at Appalachian. It's my very great pleasure this morning to introduce you to this Author Meets Critics panel with Shawn Michelle Smith, author of the book Photographic Returns, Racial Justice and the Time of Photography, published on Duke University Press in 2020. I'm going to begin by introducing myself and my co-panelists. I'll let you know a bit about how this panel will be structured, and then I'll introduce our guest. She's going to share with us some images and talk a bit about her book, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. To introduce myself, Shawn Michelle Smith's writing on race and photography in 19th century America has greatly informed my own research, which focuses on colonial photography from the Pacific Islands. I also teach courses on art theory, museum history, the social and cultural histories of photography, and oceanic art and visual culture here at Appalachian. I'll now introduce my co-panelists. Dr. Mira Waits is an architectural historian of modern and contemporary South Asia and is assistant professor of art history here at Appalachian. Her research focuses on post-colonial theory, visual culture studies, modern architecture and urbanism, and social justice studies. She has published in the journal Visual Culture in Britain and the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, as well as in the anthology Across Time and Space, Architecture and the Politics of Modernity. She is currently working on a book project entitled Colonial Carcerality, The Birth of the Modern Prison in India, which explores the spatial history of the British colonial prisons in India. Dr. Christina Varano Sornito Carter earned her PhD in sociocultural anthropology in 2015 from Columbia University. She is an assistant professor and co-director of the App State Ethnography Lab in the Department of Anthropology here at Appalachian. Her book manuscript in progress, In the House of Santa Regla, Specters of the Post-Colonial Philippines, examines the convergence of global capitalism, colonial histories, indigenous spirit worlds, and rapid climate change in the central Philippines. In addition, Christina writes and makes films about time, magic, climate change in the tropics, intergenerational trauma, and the resonances of modernity in Southeast Asia, and decolonizing methods in media anthropology. Dr. Kenyon Sito is professor of theater and performance studies at Appalachian and author of The Martial Arts Cinema of the Chinese Diaspora. Her writings have appeared in Visual Anthropology, Oxford Bibliographies on Cinema and Media Studies, Jump Cut, a review of contemporary media, The China Quarterly, Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, Dance Chronicle, and elsewhere. She has also written chapters for edited volumes on film and performance studies. So before I introduce our guest, I'd like to give the audience a sense of how this panel will unfold. Each of the panelists read Professor Smith's book and provided her beforehand with comments and questions. After Professor Smith presents about her book, I thought we'd start our Q&A by posing one of these questions as a jumping off point. After that, each of the panelists will have an opportunity to ask a question in turn. We'll then move on to audience questions. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please post it to the Q&A. And now it's my very great honor to introduce our guest. Shawn Michelle Smith is an historian and theorist of photography, as well as a practicing artist. Her monographs include American Archives, Gender, Race, and Class in Visual Culture from 1999, and Photography on the Color Line, W.E.B. Du Bois, Race and Visual Culture from 2004. Her 2013 book, At the Edge of Sight, Photography and the Unseen, won the Lawrence Levine Award for Best Book in American Cultural History from the Organization of American Historians and the Jean Goldman Book Prize at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She has also edited and co-authored several texts, including Lynching Photographs from 2017. Her many essays on photography and race have been published in anthologies and journals such as Aperture and Photography and Culture. She is Professor of Visual and Critical Studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she also serves as Interim Dean of Faculty. Please join me in welcoming Shawn Michelle Smith.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you all for being here today. I felt very honored to be invited to participate in this symposium, and we're living in such extraordinary and difficult times that it feels like a real luxury to take a moment to have a conversation about the book and to think with you all about some photographs that I find very fascinating and compelling. So, as Heather told you, my co-panelists have spent some time with the book, and I really appreciate their engagement. I'm looking forward to the conversation with them. It's my understanding that other people who are just tuning in might not have spent any time with the book at all. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes before we start the conversation telling you a little bit about the project and looking at a couple of the images that I study in the work, just by way of giving you a sense of the arc of the book and its argument, and just to help orient you a little bit for this conversation. So in general, the book is about contemporary artists, some who would identify as photographers, some who would identify as contemporary artists who use photography occasionally or quite often in their work. But it's all artists who are working in the 21st century. So they're contemporary artists, but they're looking back to these earlier moments in US history. And they're pretty consistently looking back to earlier moments in US history that now figure prominently in the cultural history of photography in the US as well. So they're looking back to earlier moments in US history, and sometimes they're looking back actually to historical photographs in their work. Each chapter is focused on a different artist and usually just on one series of their work, sometimes even on just a single photograph. And what I argue across the chapters is that these artists are using photography because they're interested in what I'm calling the oscillating time of photography, the sort of unusual and unsteady temporality of the photograph. So the photograph's representation of the past moment in which it was made, and also the present moment in which a viewer is looking at it and engaging it. And then the way that a photograph is also always anticipating a future viewer. So at any moment in which we're looking at a photograph, I think we have a past moment encountered in the present, and with also the sort of anticipation of a future moment in which another viewer will be looking at this image. And so that kind of collapsing of time, I think, is fascinating to me about photography. And I think that these artists are using that collapsing of time to bring these past moments into our present in very profound ways. And also bringing past moments of racial crisis into the present by way of demonstrating that the work of racial justice remains unfinished in the United States. So that's the kind of overarching argument of the book, and it plays out with different nuances in each of the separate case studies. And I thought that I would start today by just showing you a couple of images from the book. And I hope that then the way I'm thinking with images and the way these artists are using photography to think about US history will become a little bit more clear. So I am going to try to share, let's see. Okay, so is the screen sharing working for you all? Yes, good. Okay, great. So this work is by the photographer Dawood Bey, and it's from a project that he completed in 2012 and 2013 called the Birmingham Project. And so this doubled portrait is one piece from the project, and its title is Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin. It was made in 2012. And you are seeing the work as you would see it in a gallery. So it is, it's two portraits that are framed together. So the piece is, it's one piece that is a double portrait of these two people. So Bey was actually commissioned to create this work by the Birmingham Museum of Art. And the Birmingham Museum of Art was looking to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama on September 15, 1963. So that bombing was a terrorist white supremacist act that killed 4 African-American girls, 4 adolescents. And then in the aftermath, the violent aftermath of this bombing, of protests and outrage, 2 African-American boys were also killed. And so the names of the victims are Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. And the 2 African-American boys were Virgil Ware and Johnny Robinson. So this is the act that the Birmingham Museum was looking to recognize and to commemorate. So Dawood Bey spent time in Birmingham. He did a lot of research. He spent a lot of time with Birmingham residents. And in this series, what he's done is photographed one young person who, I'm sorry if I'm moving the image around, I don't need to be doing that, sorry. So he photographed one young person who was the age that the victim was at the time of the bombing, and then another adult person who was the age that the victim would have been had she survived. And then each set is paired in this double portrait. And Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin are photographed in Bethel Baptist Church, which is known as an activist congregation in Birmingham today. And that was important to Bey because the 16th Street Baptist Church was also known as an activist congregation. So it was a place in 1963 that people would meet. They would congregate there they would gather there before marches and demonstrations. And it was a largely African-American congregation. And because it was so politically activist, I mean, this was one of the reasons that it became a target for white supremacist terrorists at the time. So I'm really interested in, I think this is a beautiful piece. I think it's a very elegiac piece. I think that the direct looks that we have from Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin, they're looking directly at the camera, but this has the effect of them looking directly at us as viewers. And I think that those very direct looks invite us to consider and recognize and remember the victims of this terrorist act, and also the people who survived in the wake of that act. So we have, both of them are standing as surrogates. Both Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin are standing as surrogates for this victim, one representing the life that was lost, that was ended, and another representing the life that could have been. But also Cassandra Griffin, would have been, say, 11 or 14 at the time of the bombing. And so then she had to live and move forward with the knowledge that children her age had been killed, had been the attacks of this anti-Black violence. And so she had to live with the knowledge of her own vulnerability to such violent acts as well, and survive that. And so then I'm interested also then in what happens, the way that this piece creates a kind of intergenerational dialogue as well between Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin. So they're both standing in for this victim, but of course they're both also there to be represented themselves as well. So I think that this is just a really powerful piece about the Birmingham community as well as about this tragedy. To my mind, I think that we can also think about this as a kind of theoretical treatise for the way that photographs function both across time and through time, so that the photograph both represents the time of its making and then catapults that moment into a present moment of its viewing, even as it also represents all of the moments in between and all of the other viewers who have seen it incrementally over time, and then again anticipates a future viewer. So I'm interested in this work as a memorial and also as a kind of theoretical proposition about photography and its relationship to time and to memory and to history. So Bay suggests that it was not only the commission from the Birmingham Museum of Art, but also a photograph that sent him back to Birmingham. And this was a photograph that Bay saw as a child in 1964. And so he would have been about 10 or 11 at the time. And it's a photograph that was taken at the time of the bombing, just within days of the bombing, by Frank Dandridge, who was an African-American photographer. And the photograph is of 12-year-old Sarah Collins, who was the younger sister of Addie Mae Collins. So Addie Mae Collins was killed in the bombing, and Sarah Collins was also in the church, but she survived the bombing. Although she was terribly injured, she survived the bombing. And so Frank Dandridge photographed her in her hospital bed, with her parents' permission, photographed her in her hospital bed. And then this photograph ran in Life magazine. And then a year later, it was published in a book called The Movement, Documentary of a Struggle for Equality, which was a photo book that had text by Lorraine Hansberry. And so Dawood Bey saw it in 1964 as it was published in this book. And the photograph itself is very striking. Sarah Collins is in her hospital bed, and she's facing the camera, so she's looking at the camera, but her eyes are completely covered over in white bandages. So she's looking at the camera, but with this blank stare. And she did, in fact, lose an eye due to her injuries, due to this bombing. So Bay talks about being a child and seeing this photograph of this injured child, and it sort of returning to Bay with this commission and launching him back to Birmingham as well. So there's a photographic return involved here, but it's a little bit oblique. So you wouldn't look at the portrait of Mathis Manaphy and Cassandra Griffin and necessarily think of the photograph of Sarah Collins, but nevertheless, there is this sort of oblique photographic return or impulse to return inspired by a photograph that helped to launch this project for Dawood Bay. So some of the photographic returns, what I'm calling photographic returns, where people are either returning to photographs or photographs are returning to them, are a little bit oblique and askew like this, and some of them are very, very direct. And so I want to give you just a little bit of a sense of some of the more direct returns as well. So this is a piece from Carrie Mae Weems's series Constructing History, which she completed in 2008. And this specific photograph is called Suspended Belief. So this is work that Weems created with students, and she was a distinguished visiting professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design in 2008 at the Atlanta campus of the Savannah College of Art and Design. And while she was there, she created with students this body of work called Constructing History that is about the civil rights movement and the social and political protests of the 1960s and 1970s. And so overall, the work consists of 21 black and white photographs and also a video that shares the name Constructing History. And what was really interesting and compelling to me about this work is that the photographs, and I mostly focus on the photographs in the series, but the photographs are actually reenactments of historical photographs from the civil rights era. So students and Weems went back to these historical photographs and reenacted them to be photographed again. So I'm interested in the layers of mediation here, but also in the fact of reenactment and what does it mean to embody a moment as it is recorded in a photograph to then rephotograph it again. So this piece is a reenactment of a famous photograph made by John Philo in 1970. And Philo calls his photograph the Kent State Protest. And the photograph documents the massacre at Kent State University in Ohio. So on May 4, 1970, there was a large student protest of the war in Vietnam. The protest had gone on for a number of days. The Ohio National Guard was called in. And on May 4, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on the protesters and killed 4 students and injured another 9 students. And so the students who were killed were Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krauss, and Sandra Shore. So Philo's photograph shows Jeffrey Miller as he lays slain, and then also Mary Vecchio, who was a young 14-year-old student who was visiting the campus that day. John Philo, the photographer, was himself a student at Kent State University at the time, and this photograph made the front page cover of the New York Times, and it also won the Pulitzer Prize. So I'm interested in Weems's project for a number of reasons, some of which I've mentioned. Other reasons are that she created this work with students, and it's not particularly apparent in the selections that I'm showing you here today, but this space that she has constructed, it's a studio space, but she called it a classroom space. And in other images in the series, you can see it's actually set up with desks, so it very much resembles a classroom. And one of the things that she says in the voiceover for this piece, let me see if I can just read this voiceover for you. Yeah, so in the video, the photographs have just these very minimal titles like suspended belief. There's no further narration or text with the photographs. But in the video, there's this extended voiceover that is Weems herself. And so my reading of the photographs is very much informed by the narrative in the video. And so in the video, the narrator says, quote, "In this constructed place, our classroom, we revisit the past. The students examine the facts and will participate in the construction of history, a history that has been told to them by others," end quote. And Weems, in these photographs, has made no attempt to hide the constructedness of these scenes. And again, the whole series is called Constructing History. But you can see in this image and in another image that I'll show in just a second, that this sort of plinth or platform has been constructed in this classroom studio space. And this track around it is actually the track for a moving camera. And so over here you can sort of just barely see, this is the large tripod and the cart on which the video camera would circle around these two figures on this stadium. You can see that the students have also selected out just a portion of the photograph to reenact the kind of central figures in the photograph. So they're not aiming to reproduce the whole thing, but sort of what they see as essential to the image. Okay, I want to show just one more photograph from this series. This piece called Mourning, again from 2008. And in this one you get a little bit of a better sense of the studio classroom space. As well, you can see the tracking and the tripod for the camera, the video camera, much more clearly in this piece. This particular photograph, Mourning, is a reenactment and recreation of this famous historical photograph by photographer Juanita Sleet Jr. And the photograph, Sleet's photograph, shows Coretta Scott King comforting her daughter Bernice at the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral on April 9, 1968. And they're at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. One of the things that I think is important about this tracking camera is that it draws attention to not only the mediation of history through photography in our experience of this piece by Weems, but also the mediation of the original historical photograph and its event. So Weems herself would have been alive in 1968 as a young person, but even she, like so many other people who were alive in the 60s and 70s, would have experienced these historical events largely as mediated through photographs. So even at the historical moment, even at the time, most people's experience of this history was mediated through an encounter with photographs. I'd like to say just one more thing about the Carrie Mae Weems piece. It is entitled Mourning, and there is a very melancholic tone to this work. Many of the photographs that she and the students work with are of assassinations and murders. And so necessarily the work has a melancholic tone, which also runs throughout many of the works that I look at in the book, so many of the chapters of the book as well. I am interested the piece is titled Mourning, but I'm interested in thinking about it in relationship to melancholia. And so as Freud draws the distinction between mourning and melancholia, he describes mourning as a process of grieving in which the bereaved is actually gradually able to release, to let go of what has been lost and learns to live without what has been lost. So that for Freud is the process of mourning. And in melancholia, Freud suggests that this is a process of grieving without end. So in melancholia, the bereaved refuses to let go of what has been lost and refuses to live without it. And so I think that there is a way in which melancholia is a kind of grief that won't let go, but it's also an attachment to the past. And so I'm interested in thinking about the kind of parallels between melancholia and photography as two processes, one a technology that establish a relationship to the past that keeps it activated in the present. So a relationship to the past that refuses to let go of it and holds onto it in the present. And again, I think that this is also the way, to my mind, time works in photography and through photography. So I think I will end there and look forward to the conversation. So let me see, do I have to take it off screen share somehow? There, okay, great.
Wonderful. Shawn, thank you so much for that. These are just such extraordinary images. So Shawn, I'm going to start our conversation with a question that comes from one of the panelists. It was in the notes we gave you. It comes from Christina Sornito Carter, but this question is sort of just asking you to reflect on your process of the aftermath of writing the book. And then each of us are going to ask a question in turn that goes through the chapters in the order of the book. And then hopefully we'll have time for some audience questions as well. So the question that Christina gave you was, after writing this book, have your observations have any impact or changed your own pedagogy? And then the second part, what time periods or events over your lifetime make you reflect on how you might creatively try to work with the problem of proximity in memory and history? In other words, what memory images would you seek to engage?
This is a big question, and yes. I really appreciate it. It was, especially the teaching part of this question was really interesting to me to think about, because it made me realize that it isn't so much that the book has transformed the way I think about teaching, as that perhaps teaching actually led me to think about putting contemporary artworks into conversation with images from the past, with historical images. And in part that came about, like this hadn't occurred to me before Christina asked the question, and so I really appreciate that. But I've been teaching at the School of the Art Institute for 14 years now, and I had taught at universities before coming to SAIC, and so this was my first experience teaching at an art school. And so I'm teaching contemporary artists, right? And I was teaching 19th century photography. And I was finding that it was a bit of a hard sell. Some of my students were not super interested in 19th century photography. And so I started to pair the photographers from the 19th century with the work of contemporary artists who are using photography. And so like the Countess Castiglione, who sort of famously in the 19th century commissioned all of these self-portraits. And she was very performative, and she worked closely with the photographer, and they staged all of these tableaus. I paired the Countess de Castiglione with someone like Cindy Sherman or Nikki S. Lee. And the photographer Clementina Haywardin, who in the 19th century photographed her children, her daughters, again in these theatrical tableaus. I paired her work with Sally Mann, who also, you know, in the late 20th century famously photographed her children. And I found that these juxtapositions were really interesting, and it did actually make the 19th century much more interesting and exciting to the students that I was working with. And they were also struck by the kind of contemporary issues that these, in the case of these two, these 19th century women were employing photography in ways that were actually quite similar to these contemporary artists. So I think that actually that, you know, that change that happened in my teaching as I came to SAIC and was working with contemporary artists, I had the feeling that that probably influenced the way that I was willing to work in this book. And certainly being at SAIC, I mean, this is the first time that I have written extensively about contemporary art in any way. And so I think that that's also in part motivated by being at SAIC. So I do also have plans to now teach a course that would be largely inspired by this specific book. And had plans to do that this spring, and then was asked to take on this administrative role for a couple of years. So that has been put on hold, but it is on the books, and so I do look forward to the moment when I can teach a course that comes from the book. So the second part of the question was more about my kind of biographical, historical engagement with images and memory images. Yeah, so, and this again, you know, there's another sort of teaching link to this. The Abu Ghraib photographs from 2004 were, you know, I think for so many people at the time, very powerful and politically motivating photographs. And so they were for me as well. And I remember, you know, just a couple of years ago, referring to them in a class and saying, well, you remember, of course, the Abu Ghraib photographs. And a student said, vaguely, but like, when was that again? And I said, well, 2004, which to me seems very close. And they said, you know, we were really little kids in 2004. So I feel like that was a kind of moment to me of realizing, you know, a little bit of a generation gap between me and my students. And this is one of the things that I think Carrie Mae Weems in her Constructing History says quite explicitly, that she was trying to think about, you know, how to talk about a history that she had lived through with students who had not lived through this history. So that was a sort of moment that kind of, for me, that was parallel to the one that I think Weems draws out so creatively and extensively in her work. Another image that has been really important to me of late is a historical image that it predates my life. So it predates me, but I feel, I don't know, compelled to reckon with it. And I can share this photograph with you as well. Let's see if I can. Can you all see this image? Yeah, okay. So this is a photograph taken by Will Counts, and it shows Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine. the Little Rock Nine were the 9 African-American students who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And to me, the photograph, it's compelling in so many different ways. Just to think about the strength and bravery of Elizabeth Eckford and the other students of the Little Rock Nine, but also to think of the response of the white students in this crowd. And this is the thing that has been very striking to me. I should just say that, so for those of you who don't know this story, Elizabeth Eckford was meant to go in with the whole group of 9 students. They were meant to enter the school together, and something happened. She didn't get the last communication from the group. So she showed up and she was there by herself. So she entered the school by herself. And as you can see in this photograph, there was a crowd, an angry white crowd of fellow students and also people in the community of Little Rock. And so I have been focused on the white women in this crowd, and the woman who has her mouth open screaming behind Elizabeth Eckford is Hazel Bryan. And I've just been trying to think as a white woman about, what legacies from this moment do I inherit? What are the legacies that I have to reckon with? What are the privileges from this moment that I have inherited? And how do I reckon and grapple with that? So although this photograph, and this event in 1957 predates my lifetime by 8 years at least, to me it still feels important as a kind of legacy to grapple with for me as a white woman, and in thinking about the way that white supremacism persists and the way that white women have been catalysts and have also borne the privileges of white supremacy in the US. Did you want me to say more about that, or?
Kenyon, I believe you're going to ask the first question from the panelists.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So, I would like to give a brief summary of the commentary I gave just so I can let the audience know where the question comes from. So the book opens with a chapter in the ways that photography brings together images from different moments of history and merges them together in new ways of reminding us of generation of systemic racism and violence. So memory and history are closely intertwined. If the history of photography resides in the history of memory itself, then history actually inhabits the present in the very real ways, and the practice of history is always an exercise of power. And that history matters in all senses of this work. So in the book, you explore the revelations and limitation of photographic vision and evidence, and ask us to critically consider different ways of looking at the visual archive as a whole. So this dynamic of revelation and limitation is political. And as a reader, I'm eager to know more about photographic narrativity in relation to paintings and drawings that paved the way for photography, and film and television, digital video, and multimedia that followed it. In comparison to the other visual and media arts, how does photography enhance new forms of power in the history of structural and systemic violence? By invoking the succession of time as unstable and open-ended, photography anticipates the future of its viewers and charts new social and political identities and positions. So how does art in general and photography in particular opens us to such a becoming? As Deleuze reminds us, quote, thoughts and arts are real and disturb the reality, morality, and economy of the world. So that's my summary of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was really interested in the part of your question that's about how does photography maybe enhance or open up new forms of power in a history of structural and systemic violence. And I'd like to show just two images from the first chapter, because you said you were particularly focused on the first chapter. And so I think this is a kind of, I'm reading them as a sort of direct call and response. And I think that if we think about these two images in conversation with one another, it will help to get us to an answer to your lovely and complex question. So this is a photograph by the contemporary artist Rashid Johnson, and it's called Self-Portrait with My Hair Parted Like Frederick Douglass of 2003. And in some ways I'm seeing it also as a kind of reenactment or recreation, in that it very carefully recreates a portrait of Frederick Douglass, and it's this portrait of Frederick Douglass that was taken sometime between 1847 and 1852 by the daguerreotypist Samuel J. Miller. And this is a large, it's a half-plate daguerreotype that's very beautiful, and it's in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. And Rashid Johnson studied for some time in Chicago, and so I'm fairly certain that this is a very direct recreation. That Johnson's portrait is a very direct recreation of this Douglass daguerreotype. And you can see that he's just dressed formally and posed himself in the exact same way, and that even his direct stare at the camera replicates this powerful stare of Douglass. And so in this chapter, really the weight of the chapter falls on Douglass and on Douglass's performance of photography and his thoughts and theory of photography in the 19th century. So Frederick Douglass was actually the most photographed American of the 19th century. So more photographed than Lincoln, than Whitman. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century. And so he embraced this new technology very enthusiastically in his own performances for the camera. But he also wrote about photography, and in two of the lectures that he gave, one in 1861 and one in 1865, he talked about the revolutionary power of this new technology. And for him, it was a revolutionary new tool of self-representation. For people who did not have access to such forms of self-representation, who did not have access to portraiture via painting, which was a much more expensive and cumbersome process. So Douglass says, even the servant girl now can have a portrait that couldn't have even been imagined by the likes of kings several years ago. So he embraced photography as this revolutionary new technology through which people could claim not only self-representation, but a form of self-possession. And so for Douglass, as a formerly enslaved person, to be able to claim self-possession was both metaphorical and literal. And he saw photography as one of the vehicles through which this could happen. Even as he is embracing photography so enthusiastically, however, he also notes that photography has certain things that we might say are ambivalent about it. So he said that another thing that might happen with photographs is that it would keep us looking backwards, right? So On the one hand, it would keep our loved ones around us, and so our ancestors could be remembered and could be made present for us. And again, for the formerly enslaved, this was a hugely important way to counteract the social death of slavery and the severing of ancestral and family lines. Okay, so through photography, one could keep one's ancestors present, but this might also keep one looking towards the past as opposed to looking towards the future, and it might make one inherently more conservative than one might otherwise be, to be looking to the past in this way. I think that Douglass, in his portraits, is looking forward to a future viewer, and I think there's a kind of call in his portraits that Rashid Johnson receives, that he heeds and responds to in his own portrait. Another of the things that Douglass said is that photography, while allowing one to establish oneself in a social and political arena, photography could also make one a fixed fact in that public arena. So people would then have an image of one that they might demand one adhere to, right? So it could actually limit one's capacity to change within these social and political spheres as well. And so he said that one of the, if not exactly a danger, one of the potential problems of photography was that it could also make one a fixed fact, a kind of public property. And he actually uses those words, public property. And so again, I think that that tension between self-ownership and being property to someone else is particularly pronounced and profound when the person who is theorizing this and thinking about this is himself a formerly enslaved person. So I think just to try to directly answer the question, I think that, even very close to the moment of its advent, people who were thinking critically about photography, like Frederick Douglass, saw in it this promise of potential, but also some potential problems or reservations. So there was both enthusiasm and a little bit of reservation as well.
Hi, Shawn. It's nice to meet you, and it's so wonderful to get to hear you talk about these images. I had the pleasure of reading Chapter 3 and Chapter 7, which was very meaningful for me as I work on institutions and particularly criminal justice institutions. So I did want to ask you perhaps a little bit more in some of the questions that I prepared about Deborah Lester's work and thinking about particularly the ways in which she is inhabiting these carceral spaces, the history of Angola, how that all comes together. And I take my questions from an institutional perspective, sort of thinking about this long history of photography and criminal justice. And I wanted to think about policing and prisons. And so my question for you was, what are the lessons that Lester's work can teach law enforcement? For example, if we think about the photograph, is there a way that the photograph can be, are there any alternatives, let's say, outside of the mugshot that those working in criminal justice institutions might use to better understand crime and better understand the people in prisons? Or is it a little bit less hopeful? Is photography's relationship to prisons and policing a failed enterprise that problematically assumes that bodies can be visually ordered as criminals according to a homogeneous formula and that crimes can be quantified into a single image?
Thank you so much for the question. I think it is the latter. I think that it is less optimistic and less hopeful. So I don't see in Deborah Lester's work lessons for, for, um, police officers or, 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 um, anyone involved with prisons and policing. I think that what Lester is, you know, if there's a lesson in Lester's work, I think it's more for general viewers. I think it's more for people who are not directly involved in policing or in the different mechanisms of the carceral state. And so I think that what Lester, by going into prisons and making portraits of people, I think that she is trying to reverse the inscription of the mugshot. Right, so the inscription of the mugshot that seeks to, or the prison identification photograph that seeks to define someone in the terms of the carceral state as a criminal, right, and to contain that person. And so by going in to the prison and making these portraits, which are images that are chosen, not coerced, right? The mugshot is always a coerced image. And so allowing people to choose how to represent themselves within the limited confines. I mean, they are people who are incarcerated, but within the limited confines of the prison, to allow people to choose how they want to be represented and present themselves to the camera. I think she is reinscribing them in that portrait tradition that, you know, in line with Douglass's thoughts on photography, like the portrait tradition becomes the space of self-representation and declaration of self-ownership, right? And so those portraits then become, you know, moments or ways in which the incarcerated can reinscribe themselves as subjects who are not completely confined or contained by the logics of the carceral state. And so then I think that she's, you know, opening up that space for people who are incarcerated, but also then for viewers to try to help people undo or unlearn the ways in which those visual technologies have been used to teach other people how to recognize and see and identify and whom to assume might be a criminal, right? Or someone who could perform a criminal act. So that's where I think Lester's real critique is coming in. It's to the larger kind of viewing population and teaching us to undo and unlearn and learn to see differently.
Hi, Shawn. This is Christina Sornito Carter. It's really nice to meet you. I was really excited to read this book. I teach anthropology of media, among other things. And so it was a real joy and pleasure to look at this piece, and I'll definitely be using it in my future classes. I focused on actually the chapters you began with, on the work of Carrie Mae Weems and Dawood Bey. And so more generally, I find myself, both as a scholar and someone who is looking at photographs and reading your book, I find myself ensnared in this oscillating time as a viewer myself. So that's why I asked the question of pedagogy. But also, I'm interested in the question of spectrality, because that's what I look at in my work. And there's something about spectrality that's an uncanny nature of photographs that you tease out. And so I wanted to ask, I know there's a legacy, of course, of 19th century spirit photography, mostly done by well-to-do white people who were, you know, trying to channel dead spirits and try to demonstrate that or show that in different kinds of photographic techniques. But what's interesting about your focus on contemporary artists working with some of these slower processes actually, is that it made me think actually that it's a form of spirit photography, because it does invoke a kind of, not just even spectral past, but as you just said with this Frederick Douglass's photograph speaking to this other contemporary photographer, it is a kind of calling out to a future unborn. So on both sides of the equation, there seems to me like this oscillating time, a kind of time out of joint, as Derrida puts it, that I think is really interesting in terms of how that might actually shift what spirit photography was, which is now it seems to be a political act, especially in the way that you've couched it in your book. And I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, my main comment was that I loved this question when I saw it. And I have written a little bit elsewhere about spirit photography and spirit photography as a kind of metaphor for the time of photography, right? It's kind of an encapsulation of the time of photography. And I hadn't been thinking about this contemporary political work as spirit photographs, but I think that one absolutely could. And then I love the way that you turned the question just now to suggest that that then this contemporary work, if we can consider it as a kind of spirit photography, and again, I think that makes sense for a lot of reasons, especially with the aura of melancholia that I think surrounds the Weems' work and a number of the other works in the book. And I think that spirit photographs in the 19th century were also part and parcel of a culture of mourning and practices, a very extensive and elaborate practice of mourning in the 19th century, and that spirit photographs participated in that culture of mourning. So I think that there are some direct links even between the way mourning and melancholia are working around these contemporary works. But then I love the turn that you just posed too, is like now if we look back from the works in photographic returns to spirit photographs, can we then see spirit photographs functioning in a political way as well? And I think that I haven't done particularly much work in thinking about the political project of spirit photography in the 19th century. But I think that you're suggesting that that would be a really fruitful avenue to pursue.
Can I just do a quick follow-up?
Sure.
I guess what I was thinking, and it's interesting the political project of 19th century photography. I guess what I was thinking is when you talk about how across the book, these photographs suggest that the work of racial justice is unfinished. So actually the reception of especially when you think about mourning and melancholia, one could also be mourning futures that didn't arrive, that were hoped for, the substance of things hoped for, and never came to pass. And so, and you call it the unfinished work of racial justice. So I guess that's what I'm gesturing towards more, is perhaps is spirit photography done from the perspective of formerly colonized or people who were kidnapped and enslaved, perhaps a kind of spirit photography that is just inevitably political.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for rephrasing the question. I think Ulrich Baer, in his book Spectral Evidence, talks about the futurity of the photograph. And I don't know if Baer so much calls on Walter Benjamin, but I've thought quite a bit about Walter Benjamin and the way he talks about a spark of futurity being captured in the photograph, right? And so I've found that very compelling to think about, like, what is that spark of futurity? What is the potential? And what are the potential futures that are imagined from that point? And so what Baer goes back and says is that, at the moment that the photograph is taken, we're looking back to this moment in which the future was undetermined, right? In which multiple potential futures were possible. And so I think that, as you've just said, like then when we look back, those multiple futures still reside in that photograph. And to me, there is a power in that, right? Like there are the unredeemed futures that are still possible in the time of that photograph, despite the failures of our present moment, to enable them to come to fruition, or of the intervening history to enable them to come into fruition. And so, to my mind, the political project is about failure and the unfinished work, but I'm trying to also hold out a little bit of a sense that those futures that were unredeemed or denied might still be possible in some future moment. So.
Shawn, I have a really wonderful question from a colleague. This comes from Sushmita Chatterjee, who is a faculty member here and director of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, and told me she was a big fan of your work and is super excited that you're here today. She says, whether in The Return of History or The Attention to the Invisible and Unseen, Shawn Michelle Smith's attention to visual politics always moves beyond the frame and indeed haunts it. When photography haunts, what do we do about the bad ghosts?
So this follows up really nicely from, I think, the path, right? So the bad ghost is really interesting, and there are bad ghosts, right? Let me just back up a little bit and say that part of the way, I think I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate that some of the returns, I think, are intentional, like photographers going back to moments, and other returns, in the way I'm thinking about them, are not intentional, and so they would evoke a kind of haunting, right? So the image, the moment that comes back unbeckoned, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad ghost, but it is a ghost maybe that comes back without an invitation, persistently. And part of that dynamic, I've been thinking about in the chapter that's on Jason Lazarus. It starts with his standing at the grave of Emmett Till, day of exhumation. And so thinking with Lazarus and with that photograph about the way that the lynching and murder of Emmett Till continues to return. And I didn't actually know, like Jason Lazarus's photograph taught me that Emmett Till his body actually was exhumed 50 years after his death. And so that forensic scientists could do DNA testing on the body to confirm that it was Emmett Till's body. And but so just thinking about I guess the return of the repressed in a way, like the literal return of Till's body, and then the haunting, the way in which I think US history is haunted by that death, and the way in which his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, used photography and used the photographs of the corpse of her son in this political manner, right, to incite. I mean, some people would say, that seeing the photographs of Till's body was what ignited the civil rights movement in 1955. And so, so I don't think that Till is a bad ghost. I think that like the white supremacists who have perpetuated these acts of violence, like those might be the bad ghosts that also return, right? And that also do haunt the present. And it's not only the past haunting the present, right? This is also very active in our present moment. But I guess that's one of the ways in which I'm thinking about what returns and how it returns. So unbeckoned, but again, I wouldn't say that Till's is a bad ghost, but the white supremacists who are also, of course, present and brought back through those images, those might be the bad ghosts that are haunting and active in our present moment as well.
Thank you for that. Shawn, I believe we have time for one last question. And this one comes from a student. It comes from Nate Caroon, who is a senior in our art management program. And I think it also draws really nicely on this past question. He asks if you think that analog processes in photography will ever be lost to time. It seems to me, he says, that no matter the period in photography, there was always a focus on older techniques. Does this make photography an inherently repetitive or cyclical medium, or is it no different than the cycles of technique we've seen in painting and sculpture?
I love the question, and I love, Heather, that there's a stereoscope in your in your office here. Speaking of 19th century analog technologies, yeah. So I really appreciate this question, and it was something that was very striking to me and startling to me. How many of the artists that I was looking at, again, like working in the 2000s and 2010s, were using these analog processes. And but that was fascinating to me. And it wasn't just that they were using film and making prints. It was that they might be using wet collodion, right? 19th century processes. And so Deborah Luster uses them, and also Sally Mann. You know, the wet collodion could not be more cumbersome, right? Like you have to actually apply chemistry to a plate and then expose the plate while it's still damp, while it's still wet. So that means you have to bring a darkroom apparatus with you to the site in which you're photographing, which for Sally Mann, in the cases that I look at, are Civil War battlefields. And so she's going to Civil War battlefields and photographing them like Civil War photographers, sort of reenacting or recreating the process of photography that Alexander Gardner and William Gibson would have been using at these sites. But that was surprising to me to see, and also to see that it wasn't just sort of one or two people who had done workshops at the Eastman Photography Center, but who, like, just really a lot of people working in these analog mediums. And I don't know exactly how to explain that, but I do think that it's interesting the way it slows down the process of photography. And so in this digital age, and so many people have phones on their cameras, and this unbelievable proliferation of images, for photographers to want to slow it down and be able to expose, you know, in an hour, one plate, and not know if the image was going to, you know, be a successful image or not until, you know, developing it, was interesting to me. And I guess I thought that that kind of slowness, like, it is also a way of sitting with images, even as they are being made, like sitting with the process, being present with the process of making images in a way that I think is really interesting. There's part of the question that was also about, you know, is photography a kind of repetitive process? And I see, I guess I would say yes. I mean, and especially I think it is drawn out in the artists that I'm looking at. There's this recursivity, right, of photographers looking back to earlier images to produce photographic works. There's a really interesting recursivity there that I do think is at least heightened. Like, if it isn't exclusive to photography, I think it's at least heightened in photography. And if we even think about the way that analog film photography is a negative positive process by which you can make multiple copies, I think that, you know, even in there, it's sort of technologically rooted, the idea of copies and repetitions and returns.
Shawn, we are at time now, but thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I did want to tell you, we have a colleague here, Joshua White in photography, who makes tintypes. And every spring he works with our students and they have a tintype day. And people from the, from campus, but also from community come in and have tintype portraits made, and the profits are used to fund students going to the SPE conference. So it's a really great connection of, photographic pedagogy and learning these old processes, and just sort of building some community connections as well. So
that's fabulous. I love it.
yeah, it's a fantastic day. It's so fun. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's just been such an honor to have you, and hopefully we can have you in person someday and talk more about these there's just a lot of rich material here to discuss further, I think. So thank you so much for this. And thanks to my fellow panelists for being just such wonderful parts of this conversation as well. I'm really grateful for all the work you put in as well. Well, for the folks in the audience, Nancy,
briefly, thank you all so much.
Please.
Thank you all so much. This was really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. For the folks in the audience, Nancy asked me to remind everyone that we have a brief break now, and we'll resume for our next session at 10:30. So thanks to everyone, and hope to see everyone soon. Stay safe.